Robinson Crusoe by Daniel Defoe. Chapter 1. Robinson's family, his elopement from his parents. I was born in the year 1632 in the city of York, of a good family, though not of that country, my father being a foreigner of Bremen, who settled first at Hull. He got a good estate by merchandise, and leaving off his trade, lived afterward at York, from whence he had married my mother, whose relations were named Robinson, a very good family in that country, and from whom I was called Robinson Crusoe. But by the usual corruption of words in England, we are now called, nay, we call ourselves, and write our name, Crusoe. And so my companions always called me. I had two elder brothers, one of which was lieutenant colonel to an English regiment of foot in Flanders, formerly commanded by the famous Colonel Lockhart, and was killed at the battle near Dunkirk against the Spaniards. What became of my second brother I never knew any more than my father and mother did know what was become of me. Being the third son of the family and not bred to any trade, my head began to be filled very early with rambling thoughts. My father, who was very old, had given me a competent share of learning as far as house education and a country free school generally goes, and designed me for the law. But I would be satisfied with nothing but going to sea. And my inclination to this led me so strongly against the will, nay, the commands of my father, and against all the entreaties and persuasions of my mother and other friends, that there seemed to be something fatal in that propension of nature tending directly to the life of misery which was to befall me. My father, a wise and grave man, gave me serious and excellent counsel against what he foresaw was my design. He had called me one morning into his chamber, where he was confined by the gout, and expostulated very warmly with me upon this subject. He asked me what reasons, more than a mere wandering inclination, I had for leaving my father's house in my native country, where I might be well introduced, and had a prospect of raising my fortunes by application and industry, with a life of ease and pleasure. He told me it was for men of desperate fortunes on one hand, or of aspiring superior fortunes on the other, who went abroad upon adventures, to rise by enterprise and make themselves famous in undertakings of a nature out of the common road, that these things were all either too far above me or too far below me, that mine was the middle state of what might be called the upper station of low life, which he had found by long experience was the best state in the world, the most suited to human happiness, not exposed to the miseries and hardships, the labor and sufferings of the mechanic part of mankind, and not embarrassed with the pride, luxury, ambition, and envy of the upper part of mankind. He told me I might judge of the happiness of this state by this one thing, viz., that this was the state of life which all other people envied, that kings have frequently lamented the miserable consequences of being born to great things, and wished they had been placed in the middle of the two extremes, between the mean and the great, that the wise man gave his testimony to this as the just standard of true felicity when he prayed to have neither poverty nor riches. He bid me observe it, and I should always find that the calamities of life were shared among the upper and lowest part of mankind, but that the middle station had the fewest disasters, and was not exposed to so many vicissitudes as the higher or lower part of mankind. Nay, they were not subjected to so many distempers and uneasiness either of body or mind as those who were, by vicious living, luxury, and extravagances on one hand, or by hard labor, want of necessities, and mean or insufficient diet on the other hands, bring distempers upon themselves by the natural consequences of their way of living, that the middle station of life was calculated for all kinds of virtues and all kind of enjoyments, that peace and plenty were the handmaids of a middle fortune, that temperance, moderation, quietness, health, satiety, all agreeable diversions, and all desirable pleasures were the blessings attending the middle station of life, that this way men went silently and smoothly through the world and comfortably out of it, not embarrassed with the labors of the hands or of the head, not sold to the life of slavery for daily bread, or harassed by perplexed circumstances which rob the soul of peace and the body of rest, not enraged with the passion of envy or secret burning lust of ambition for great things, but in easy circumstances sliding gently through the world, and sensibly tasting the sweets of living without the bitter feeling that they were happy, and learning by every day's experience to know it more sensibly. After this, he pressed me earnestly and in the most affectionate manner not to play the young man, not to precipitate myself into miseries which nature and the station of life I was born in seemed to have provided against, that I was under no necessity of seeking my bread, that he would do well for me and endeavor to enter me fairly into the station of life which he had just been recommending me, and that if I was not very easy and happy in the world, it must be my mere fate or fault that must hinder it, and that he should have nothing to answer for having thus discharged his duty in warning me against measures which he knew would be to my hurt. In a word, that as he would do very kind things for me if I would stay and settle at home as he directed, so he would not have so much hand in my misfortunes as to give me any encouragement to go away. And to close all, he told me I had my elder brother for an example, to whom he had used the same earnest persuasions to keep him from going to the Low Country wars, but could not prevail, his young desires prompting him to run into the army where he was killed. And though he said he would not cease to pray for me, yet he would venture to say to me that if I did take this foolish step, God would not bless me, and I would have leisure hereafter to reflect upon having neglected his counsel when there might be none to assist in my recovery. I observed in this last part of his discourse, which was truly prophetic, that I suppose my father did not know it to be so himself. I say, I observed the tears run down his face very plentifully, and especially when he spoke of my brother who was killed, and that when he spoke of my having leisure to repent, and none to assist me, he was so moved that he broke off the discourse and told me his heart was so full he could say no more to me. I was sincerely affected with this discourse, as indeed who could be otherwise? And I resolved not to think of going abroad any more, but to settle at home according to my father's desire. But alas, a few days wore it all off, and in short, to prevent any of my father's farther importunities, in a few weeks after, I resolved to run quite away from him. However, I did not act so hastily neither as my first heat of resolution prompted, but I took my mother at a time when I thought her a little pleasanter than ordinary, and told her that my thoughts were so entirely bent upon seeing the world that I should never settle to anything with resolution enough to go through with it, and my father had better give me his consent than force me to go without it. That I was now 18 years old, which was too late to go apprentice to a trade or clerk to an attorney. That I was sure if I did, I should never serve out my time, and I should certainly run away from my master before my time was out and go to sea. And if she would speak to my father to let me go but one voyage abroad, if I came home again and did not like it, I would go no more, and I would promise by a double diligence to recover that time I had lost. This put my mother into a great passion. She told me she knew it would be to no purpose to speak to my father upon any such subject, that he knew too well what was my interest to give his consent to anything so much for my hurt, and that she wondered how I could think of any such thing after such a discourse I had had with my father, and such kind and tender expressions as she knew my father had used to me, and that, in short, if I would ruin myself, there was no help for me. But I might depend I should never have their consent to it, that, for her part, she would not have so much hand in my destruction, and I should never have it to say that my mother was willing when my father was not. Though my mother refused to move it to my father, yet, as I have heard afterwards, she reported all the discourse to him, and that my father, after showing a great concern at it, said to her with a sigh, "That boy might be happy if he would stay at home, but if he goes abroad, he will be the miserablest wretch that was ever born. I can give no consent to it." It was not till almost a year after this that I broke loose, though in the meantime I continued obstinately deaf to all proposals of settling to business, and frequently expostulating with my father and mother about their being so positively determined against what they knew my inclinations prompted me to. But being one day at Hull, where I went casually, and without any purpose of making an elopement that time, but I say, being there, and one of my companions being going by sea to London, in his father's ship, and prompting me to go with them, with the common allurement of seafaring men, viz., that it should cost me nothing for my passage, I consulted neither father nor mother any more, nor so much as sent them word of it, but leaving them to hear of it as they might, without asking God's blessing or my father's, without any consideration of circumstances or consequences, and in an ill hour, God knows. Chapter 2. First Adventures at Sea, Experience of a Maritime Life, Voyage to Guinea. On the 1st of September 1651, I went on board a ship bound for London. Never any young adventurer's misfortunes, I believe, began sooner or continued longer than mine. The ship was no sooner gotten out of the Humber, but the wind began to blow, and the waves to rise in a most frightful manner, and as I had never been at sea before, I was most inexpressibly sick in body and terrified in mind. I began now seriously to reflect upon what I had done, and how justly I was overtaken by the judgment of heaven for my wickedness in leaving my father's house and abandoning my duty. All the good counsel of my parents, my father's tears, and my mother's entreaties came now fresh into my mind, and my conscience, which was not yet come to the pitch of hardness which it has been since, reproached me with the contempt of advice and the breach of my duty to God and my father. All this while the storm increased, and by the sea, which I had never been upon before, went very high, though nothing like what I have seen many times since, nor like what I saw a few days after, But it was enough to affect me then, who was but a young sailor and had never known anything of the matter. I expected every wave would have swallowed us up, and that every time the ship fell down, as I thought, in the trough or hollow of the sea, we should never rise more. And in this agony of mind I made my vows and resolutions that, if it would please God here to spare my life this one voyage, if I ever got my foot upon dry land again, I would go directly home to my father, and never set it into a ship again while I lived, that I would take his advice and never run myself into such miseries as these any more. Now, I plainly saw the goodness of his observations about the middle station of life, how easy, how comfortably he had lived all his days, and never had been exposed to tempests at sea or troubles on shore, and I resolved that I would, like a true, repenting prodigal, go home to my father. These wise and sober thoughts continued all the while the storm continued, and indeed some time after, but the next day the wind was abated and the sea calmer, and I began to be a little inured to it. However, I was very grave for all that day, being also a little seasick still. But towards night the weather cleared up. The wind was quite over, and a charming, fine evening followed. The sun went down perfectly clear and rose so the next morning, and having little or no wind and a smooth sea, the sun shining upon it, the sight was, as I thought, the most delightful that I ever saw. I had slept well in the night, and was now no more seasick, but very cheerful, looking with wonder upon the sea that was so rough and terrible the day before, and could be so calm and so pleasant in so little time after. And now, lest my good resolutions should continue, my companion, who had indeed enticed me away, came to me. "Well, Bob," said he, clapping me on the shoulder, "how do you do after it? I warrant you were frightened, weren't you, last night, when it blew but a capful of wind?" "A capful, do you call it?" I said. "'Twas a terrible storm." "A storm, you fool, you," replied he. "You call that a storm? Why, it was nothing at all. Gave it but a good ship and a sea room, and we think nothing of such a squall of wind as that. But you're a freshwater sailor, Bob. Come, let us take a bowl of punch, and we'll forget all that. Do you see what charming weather 'tis now?" To make short this sad part of my story, we went the old way of all sailors. The punch was made, and I was drunk with it, and in that one night's wickedness I drowned all my repentance, all my reflections upon my past conduct, and all my resolutions for my future. In a word, as the sea was returned to its smoothness of surface and settled calmness by the abatement of that storm, so the hurry of my thoughts being over, my fears and apprehensions of being swallowed up by the sea being forgotten, and the current of my former desires returned, I entirely forget the vows and promises that I made in my distress. I found indeed some intervals of reflection, and the serious thoughts did, as it were, endeavor to return again sometimes, but I shook them off, and roused myself from them as if it were from a distemper, and applying myself to drink and company, soon mastered the return of those fits, for I so called them, and I had in 5 or 6 days got as complete a victory over conscience as any young fellow that resolved not to be troubled with it could desire. But I was to have another trial for it still, and Providence, as in such cases generally it does, resolved to leave me entirely without excuse. For if I would not take this for a deliverance, the next was to be such a one as the worst and most hardened wretch among us would confess both the danger and the mercy. The 6th day of our being at sea, we came into Yarmouth Roads. The wind having been contrary and the weather calm, we had made but little way since the storm. here we were obliged to come to an anchor, and here we lay, the wind continuing contrary, viz., at southwest, for 7 or 8 days, during which time a great many ships from Newcastle came into the same roads as the common arbor where the ships might wait for a wind for the river. We had not, however, rid here so long, but should have tidied it up the river, but that the wind blew too fresh. And after we had lain 4 or 5 days, blew very hard. However, the roads being reckoned as good as a arbor, the anchorage good, and our ground tackle very strong, our men were unconcerned, and not in the least apprehensive of danger, but spent the time in rest and mirth, after the manner of the sea. But the 8th day, in the morning, the wind increased, and we had all hands at work to strike our topmasts and make everything snug and close, that the ship might ride as easy as possible. By noon the sea went very high indeed, and our ship rid forecastle in, shipped several seas, and we thought once or twice our anchor had come home. Upon which our master ordered out the sheet anchor, so that we rode with 2 anchors ahead, and the cables veered out to the bitter end. By this time it blew a terrible storm indeed, and now I began to see terror and amazement in the faces even of the seamen themselves. The master, though vigilant in the business of preserving the ship, yet as he went in and out of his cabin by me, I could hear him softly, to himself, say several times, "Lord, be merciful to us. We shall be all lost. We shall be all undone," and the like. During these first hurries I was stupid, lying still in my cabin, which was in the steerage, and cannot describe my temper. I could ill reassume the first penitence, which I had so apparently trampled upon and hardened myself against. I thought the bitterness of death had been past, and that this would be nothing too like the first. But when the master himself came by me, as I said just now, and said we should be all lost, I was dreadfully frightened. I got up out of my cabin and looked out, but such a dismal sight I never saw. The sea went mountains high and broke upon us every 3 or 4 minutes. When I could look about, I could see nothing but distress around us. 2 ships that rode near us we found had cut their masts by the board, being deep laden, and our men cried out that a ship which rode about a mile ahead of us was foundered. 2 more ships, being driven from their anchors, were run out of the roads to seize at all adventures, and that with not a mast standing. The light ships fared the best, as not so much laboring in the sea, but 2 or 3 of them drove and came close by us, running away with only their spritsail out before the wind. Toward evening, the mate and boatswain begged the master of our ship to let them cut away the foremast, which he was very unwilling to do, but the boatswain protesting to him that if he did not, the ship would founder, he consented. And when they had cut away the foremast, the mainmast stood so loose and shook the ship so much, they were obliged to cut her away also and make a clear deck. Anyone may judge what a condition I must be in at all this, who was but a young sailor, and who had been in such a fright before at but a little. But if I can express at this distance the thoughts I had about me at that time, I was in tenfold more horror of mind upon account of my former convictions, and the having returned from them to the resolutions I had wickedly taken at first, than I was at death itself. And these, added to the terror of the storm, put me in such a condition that I can by no words describe it. But the worst was not come yet. The storm continued with such fury that the seamen themselves acknowledged they had never known a worse. We had a good ship, but she was deep laden and wallowed in the sea, that the seamen every now and then cried out she would founder. It was my advantage in one respect that I did not know what they meant by founder till I inquired. However, the storm was so violent that I saw what is not often seen: the master, the boatswain, and some other more sensible than the rest at their prayers, and expecting every moment that the ship would go to the bottom. In the middle of the night, and under all the rest of our distresses, one of the men that had been drowned on the purpose to sea cried out that we had sprung a leak. Another said that there was 4 foot of water in the hold. Then all hands were called to the pump. At that very word, my heart, as I thought, died within me, and I fell backwards upon the side of my bed where I sat into the cabin. However, the men roused me and told me that I, that was able to do nothing before, was as well able to pump as another, at which I stirred up and went to the pump and worked very heartily. While this was doing, the master, seeing some light colliers who, not being able to ride out the storm, were obliged to slip and run away to sea, and would come near us, ordered to fire a gun as a signal of distress. I, who knew nothing what that meant, was so surprised that I thought the ship had broke, or some dreadful thing had happened. In a word, I was so surprised that I fell down in a swoon. As this was a time when everybody had his own life to think of, nobody minded me, or what was become of me, but another man stepped up to the pump, and, thrusting me aside with his foot, let me lie, thinking I had been dead, and it was a great while before I came to myself. We worked on, but the water increasing in the hold, it was apparent that the ship would founder, and though the storm began to abate a little, yet it was not possible she could swim till we might run into a port. So the master continued firing guns for help, and a light ship, who had rid out just ahead of us, ventured a boat out to help us. It was with the utmost hazard the boat came near us, but it was impossible for us to get on board, or for the boat to lie near the ship's side, till at last the men, rowing very heartily and venturing their lives to save ours, our men cast them a rope over the stern with a buoy to it, and then veered it out a great length, which they, after great labor and hazard, took hold of, and we hauled them close under our stern and got all into their boat. It was to no purpose for them or us after we were in the boat to think of reaching to their own ship, so we all agreed to let her drive, and only to pull in towards shore as much as we could, and our master promised them that if the boat was starved upon shore, he would make it good to their master. So, partly rowing and partly driving, our boat went away to the northward, sloping towards the shore almost as far as Winterton Ness. We were not much more than a quarter of an hour out of our ship, but we saw her sink. And then I understood for the first time what was meant by a ship foundering in the sea. I must acknowledge I had hardly eyes to look upon what the seamen told me she was sinking. For from that moment, they rather put me into the boat than that I might be said to go in. My heart was, as it were, dead within me, partly with fright, partly with horror of mind, and the thoughts of what was yet before me. While we were in this condition, the men yet laboring at the oar to bring the boat near the shore, we could see when, our boat mounting the waves, we were able to see the shore, a great many people running along the shore to assist us when we should come near. But we made but slow way towards the shore, nor were we able to reach the shore till being past the lighthouse at Winterton, the shores falls off to the westward towards Cromer, and so the land broke off a little the violence of the wind. Here we got in, and though not without much difficulty, got all safe on shore, and walked afterwards on foot to Yarmouth, where, as unfortunate men, we were used with great humanity as well by the magistrates of the town, who assigned us good quarters, and as by particular merchants and owners of ships, and had money given us sufficient to carry us either to London or back to Hull, as we thought fit. Had I now had the sense to have gone back to Hull and have gone home, I had been happy, and my father, an emblem of our blessed Saviour's parable, had even killed the fatted calf for me, for hearing the ship I went away in was cast in at Yarmouth Road, it was a great while before he had any assurance that I was not drowned. But my ill fate pushed me on now with the obstinacy that nothing could resist, and though I had several times loud calls from my reason and my more composed judgment to go home, yet I had no power to do it. I know not what to call this, nor will I urge that it is a secret overruling decree that hurries us on to be the instruments of our own destruction, even though it be before us, and that we rush upon it with our eyes open, certainly nothing but some such decreed, unavoidable misery attending, and which it was impossible for me to escape, could have pushed me forward against the calm reasonings and persuasions of my most retired thoughts, and against two such visible instructions as I had met in my first attempt. My comrade, who had helped to harden me before, and who was the master's son, was now less forward than I. The first time he spoke to me after we were at Yarmouth, which was not till 2 or 3 days, for we were separated in the town to several quarters. I say, the first time he saw me, it appeared his tone was altered, and looking very melancholy and shaking his head, asked me how I did, and telling his father who I was and how I had come this voyage only for a trial in order to get farther abroad, his father turning to me with a very grave and concerned tone. "Young man," said he, "you ought never go to sea any more. You ought to take this for a plain and visible token that you are not to be a seafaring man." "Why, sir," said I, "will you go to sea no more?" "That is another case," said he. "It is my calling, and therefore my duty. But as you made this voyage for a trial, you see what a taste heaven has given you of what you are to expect if you persist. Perhaps this has all befallen us on your account, like Jonah in the ship of Tarshish. Pray," continued he, "what are you, and on what account did you go to sea?" Upon that I told him some of my story, at the end of which he burst out with a strange kind of passion. "What had I done," said he, "that such an unhappy wretch should come into my ship? I would not set my foot in the same ship with thee again for 1,000 pounds. This indeed was, as I said, an excursion of his spirits, which were yet agitated by the sense of his loss, and was farther than he could have authority to go. However, he afterwards talked very gravely to me, exhorted me to go back to my father, and not tempt Providence to my ruin, told me I might see a visible hand of heaven against me. We parted soon after, for I made him little answer, and I saw him no more. Which way he knew I know not. As for me, having some money in my pocket, I traveled to London by land, and there, as well as on the road, had many struggles with myself what course of life I should take, and whether I should go home or go to sea. As to going home, shame opposed the best motions that offered to my thoughts, and it immediately occurred to me how I should be laughed at among my neighbors, and should be ashamed to see, not my father and mother only, but even everybody else. From whence I have since observed how incongruous and irrational the common temper of mankind is, especially of youth, to that reason which ought to guide them in such cases, viz., that they are not ashamed to sin, and yet are ashamed to repent, not ashamed of the action for which they ought justly to be esteemed fools, but are ashamed of the returning, which only can make them be esteemed wise men. In this state of life, however, I remained some time, uncertain what measures to take, and what course of life to lead. An irresistible reluctance continued to going home, and as I stayed a while, the remembrance of the distress I had been in wore off, and, as that abated, the little motion I had in my desires to return wore off with it, till at last I quite laid aside the thoughts of it, and looked out for a voyage. That evil influence which carried me first away from my father's house that hurried me into the wild and indigested notion of raising my fortune, and that impressed those conceits so forcibly upon me as to make me deaf to all good advice and to the entreaties and even command of my father. I say the same influence, whatever it was, presented the most unfortunate of all enterprises to my view, and I went on board to a vessel bound to the coast of Africa, as our sailors vulgarly call it, a voyage to Guinea. It was my great misfortune that in all these adventures I did not ship myself as a sailor, whereby, though I might indeed have worked a little harder than ordinary, yet at the same time I had learned the duty and office of a foremast man, and in time might have qualified myself for a mate or lieutenant, if not for a master. But as it was always my fate to choose for the worst, so I did here. For having money in my pocket and good clothes upon my back, I would always go on board in the habit of a gentleman, and so I neither had any business in the ship or learned to do any. It was my lot first of all to fall into pretty good company in London, which does not always happen to such loose and misguided young fellows as I then was. The devil generally not omitting to lay some snare for them very early, but it was not so with me. I first fell acquainted with the master of a ship who had been on the coast of Guinea, and who, having had very good success there, was resolved to go again, and who, taking fancy to my conversation, which was not at all disagreeable at the time, hearing me say I had a mind to see the world, told me if I would go the voyage with him, I should be at no expense. I should be his messmate and his companion, and if I could carry anything with me, I should have all the advantage of it that the trade would permit, and perhaps I might meet with some encouragement. I embraced the offer, and entering into a strict friendship with this captain, who was an honest and plain-dealing man, I went the voyage with him and carried a small adventure with me, which, by the disinterested honesty of my friend the captain, I increased very considerably, for I carried about 40 pounds in such toys and trifles as the captain directed me to buy. This 40 pound I had mustered together by the assistance of some of my relations whom I corresponded with, and who, I believe, got my father, or at least my mother, to contribute so much as that to my first adventure. This was the only voyage which I may say was successful in all my adventures, and which I owe to the integrity and honesty of my friend the captain, under whom also I got a competent knowledge of the mathematics and the rules of navigation, learned how to keep an account of the ship's course, take an observation, and, in short, to understand that some things that were needful to be understood by a sailor, for as he took delight to introduce me, I took delight to learn. And in a word, this voyage made me both a sailor and a merchant, for I brought home 5 pounds 9 ounces of gold dust for my adventure, which yielded me in London at my return almost 300 pounds, and this filled me with those aspiring thoughts which have so since completed my ruin. Yet even in this voyage I had my misfortunes too, particularly that I was continually sick, being thrown into a violent fever by the excessive heat of the climate, our principal trading being upon the coast, for the latitude of 15 degrees north, even to the line itself. Chapter 3. Robinson's Captivity at Sallee, Escape with Xury, Arrival at the Brazils. I was now set up for a Guinea trader, and my friend, to my great misfortune, dying soon after his arrival, I resolved to go to the same voyage again, and I embarked in the same vessel with one who was his mate in the former voyage, and had now got the command of the ship. This was the unhappiest voyage that ever man made, for though I did not carry quite 100 pound of my new-gained wealth, so that I had 200 left, and which I lodged with my friend's widow, who was very just to me, yet I fell into terrible misfortunes in this voyage, and the first was this, viz., Our ship, making her course toward the Canary Islands, or rather between those islands and the African shore, was surprised in the grey of a morning by a Turkish rover of Sallee, who gave us chase with all the sail she could make. We crowded also as much canvas as our yards would spread and our masts carry, to have got clear, but finding the pirate gained upon us, and would certainly come up with us in a few hours, we prepared to fight, our ship having 12 guns, and the rogue 18. About 3 in the afternoon he came up with us, and bringing to, by mistake, just athwart our quarter, instead of athwart our stern, as he intended, we brought 8 of our guns to bear on that side, and poured in a broadside upon him, which made him sheer off again after returning our fire, and pouring in also his small shot from near 200 men, which he had on board. However, we had not a man touched, all our men keeping close. He prepared to attack us again, and we to defend ourselves, but laying us on board the next time upon our other quarter, he entered 60 men upon our decks, who immediately fell to cutting and hacking the decks and rigging. We plied them with small shot, half-pikes, powder chests, and such like, and cleared our deck of them twice. However, to cut short this melancholy part of the story, our ship being disabled, and 3 of our men killed and 8 wounded, we were obliged to yield, and were carried all prisoners into Sallee, a port belonging to the Moors. The usage I had there was not so dreadful as at first I apprehended, nor was I carried up the country to the emperor's court as the rest of our men were, but was kept by the captain of the rover as his proper prize, and made his slave, being young and nimble and fit for his business. At this surprising change of my circumstances from a merchant to a miserable slave, I was perfectly overwhelmed, and now I looked back upon my father's prophetic discourse to me that I should be miserable, and have none to relieve me, which I thought was now so effectually brought to pass that it could not be worse, that now the hand of heaven had overtaken me, and I was undone without redemption, but, alas, this was but a taste of the misery I was to go through, as will appear in the sequel of this story. As my new patron or master had taken me home to his house, so I was in hopes that he would take me with him when he went to sea again, believing that it would sometime or other be his fate to be taken by a Spanish or Portuguese man of war, and that then I should be set at liberty. But this hope of mine was soon taken away, for when he went to sea, he left me on shore to look after his little garden, and do the common drudgery of slaves about his house, and when he came home again from his cruise, he ordered to me lie in the cabin to look after the ship. Here I meditated nothing but my escape, and what method I might take to effect it, but found no way that had the least probability in it. Nothing presented to make this supposition of it rational, for I had nobody to communicate it to that would embark with me, no fellow slave, no Englishman, Irishman, or Scotsman there but myself, so that for 2 years, though I often pleased myself with the imagination, yet I never had the least encouraging prospect of putting it in practice. After about 2 years of odd circumstances presented itself, which put the old thought of making some attempt for my liberty again in my head. My patron lying at home longer than usual without fitting out his ship, which, as I heard, was for want of money, he used constantly, once or twice a week, sometimes oftener if the weather was fair, to take the ship's pennants and go out into the road a-fishing. And as he always took me and a young Moresco with him to row the boat, we made him very merry, and I proved very dexterous in catching fish, insomuch that sometimes he would send me with a Moor, one of his kinsmen, and the youth, the Moresco, as they called him, to catch a dish of fish for him. It happened one time that, going a-fishing in the stark calm morning, a fog rose so thick that though we were not half a league from the shore, we lost sight of him, and rowing we knew not whither or which way. We labored all the day and all the next night, and when The morning came, we found we had pulled off to sea instead of pulling in for the shore, and that we were at least 2 leagues from the shore. However, we got well in again, though with a great deal of labor and some danger, for the wind began to blow pretty fresh in the morning, but particularly we were all very hungry. But our patron, warned by this disaster, resolved to take more care of himself for the future, and having lying by him the long boat of our English ship which he had taken, he resolved he would not go a-fishing any more without a compass and some provisions. So he ordered the carpenter of his ship, who was also an English slave, to build a little stateroom or cabin in the middle of the longboat, like that of a barge, with a place to stand behind it to steer and haul home the main sheet, and room before for a hand or two to stand and work the sails. She sailed with what we called a shoulder of mutton sail, and the boom jibbed over the top of the cabin, which lay very snug and low, and had it in room for him to lie, with a slave or two, and a table to eat on, with some small lockers to put in some bottles of such liquor as he thought fit to drink, particularly his bread, rice, and coffee. We went frequently out with this boat a-fishing, and as I was most dexterous to catch fish for him, he never went without me. It happened that he appointed to go out in this boat, either for pleasure or for fish, with 2 or 3 more of some distinction in that place, and for whom he had proved extraordinary, and had therefore sent on boat overnight a larger store of provisions than ordinary, and had ordered me to get ready 3 fussies with powder and shot, which were on board his ship, for that they designed some sport of fowling as well as fishing. I got all things ready as he had directed, and waited the next morning with the boat washed clean, her ancient and pendants out, and everything to accommodate his guests, when by and by my patron came on board alone, and told me his guests had put off going, upon some business that fell out, and ordered me, with the man and boy as usual, to go out with the boat and catch them some fish, for that his friends were to sup at his house, and commanded that as soon as I had got some fish I should bring it home to his house, all which I prepared to do. This moment my former notions of deliverance darted into my thoughts, for now I found I was like to have a little ship at my command, and my master being gone, I prepared to furnish myself, not for a fishing business, but for a voyage, though I knew not, neither did I so much as consider, whither I should steer, for anywhere to get out of that place was my way. My first contrivance was to make a pretense to speak to this Moor, to get something for our subsistence on board, for I told him we must not presume to eat of our patron's bread. He said that was true, so he brought a large basket of rusk or biscuit of their kind, and 3 jars with fresh water into the boat. I knew where my patron's bottles stood, which it was evident by the make were taken out of some English prize, and I conveyed them into the boat while the Moor was on shore, as if they had been there before for our master. I conveyed also a great lump of beeswax into the boat, which weighed above 1/2 hundredweight, with a parcel of twine or thread, a hatchet, a saw, and a hammer, all of which were of great use to us afterwards, especially the wax to make candles. Another trick I tried upon him, which he innocently came into also. His name was Ishmael, who they called Moley, or Muley. So I called to him, "Moley," said I, "our patron's guns are on board the boat. Can you not get a little powder and shot? It may be we may kill some alchemies, a foal like our curlews, for ourselves, for I know he keeps the gunner's stores in the ship." "Yes," said he, "I'll bring some." And accordingly he brought a great leather pouch which held about 1.5 pounds of powder, or rather more, and another with shot that had 5 or 6 pounds with some bullets, and put all into the boat. At the same time I had found some powder of my master's in the great cabin, with which I filled one of the large bottles in the case, which was almost empty, pouring what was into it into another, and thus furnished with everything needful, we sailed out of the port to fish. This castle which is at the entrance of the port, knew who we were and took no notice of us, and we were not above a mile out of the port before we hauled in our sail and set us down to fish. The wind blew from the north-northeast, which was contrary to my desire, for had it blown southerly, I had been sure to have made the coast of Spain and at least reached to the Bay of Cadiz, but my resolutions were, blow which way it could, I would be gone from the horrid place where I was and leave the rest to fate. After we had fished some time and caught nothing, for when I had fish on my hook, I would not pull them up, that he might not see them, I said to the Moor, "This will not do. Our master will not be thus served. We must stand farther off." He, thinking no harm, agreed, and being in the head of the boat, set the sails, and as I had the helm, I run the boat out near a league further, and then brought her to as if I would fish, when, giving the boy the helm, I stepped forward to where the Moor was, and making as if I stooped for something behind him, I took him by surprise with my arm under the twist, and tossed him clear overboard into the sea. He rose immediately, for he swam like a cork, and called to me, begged to be taken in, told me he would go all over the world over with me. He swam so strong after the boat that he would have reached me very quickly, there being but little wind, upon which I stepped into the cabin, and fetching one of the fowling pieces, I presented it at him, and told him I had done him no hurt, and if he would be quiet, I would do him none. "But," said I, "you swim well enough to reach the shore, and the sea is calm. Make the best of your way to shore, and I will do you no harm, but if you come near the boat, I'll shoot you through the head, for I am resolved to have my liberty." So he turned himself about and swam for the shore, and I make no doubt he reached it with ease, for he was an excellent swimmer. I could have been content to take this Moor with me and have drowned the boy, but there was no venturing to trust him. When he was gone, I turned to the boy whom they called Xury, and said to him, "Xury, if you will be faithful to me, I'll make you a great man, but if you will not stroke your face to be true to me, that is, swear by Mahomet and his father's beers, I must throw you into the sea too." The boy smiled in my face and spoke so innocently that I could not mistrust him, and swore to be faithful to me and go all over the world with me. While I was in view of the Moor who was swimming, I stood out directly to sea with the boat, rather stretching to windward, that they might think me gone through the strait's mouth, as indeed anyone that had been in their wits must have been supposed to be, for who would have supposed we would sail on to the southward to the truly barbarian coast, where whole nations of ends were sure to be surrounded us with their canoes and destroy us, where we could ne'er go on shore, but we should be devoured by savage beasts or more merciless savages of humankind? But soon as it grew dusk in the evening, I changed my course and steered directly south and by east, bending my course a little toward the east, that I might keep in with the shore, and having a fair, fresh gale of wind and a smooth, quiet sea, I made such sail that I believed by the next day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, when I first made the land, I could not be less than 150 miles south of Sallee, quite beyond the Emperor of Morocco's dominions, or indeed of any other king thereabouts, for we saw no people. Yet such was the fright I had taken at the Moors, and the dreadful apprehensions I had of falling into their hands, that I would not stop, or go on shore, or come to anchor, the wind continuing fair till I had sailed in that manner 5 days, and then, the wind shifting to the southward, I concluded also that if any of their vessels were in chase of me, they also would now give over, so I ventured to make to the coast, and come to an anchor in the mouth of a little river. I knew not what or where, neither what latitude, what country, what nation, or what river. I neither saw or desired to see any people. The principal thing I wanted was fresh water. We came into this creek in the evening, resolving to swim to shore as soon as it was dark and discover the country. But as soon as it was quite dark, we heard such dreadful noises of the barking, roaring, and howling of wild creatures, of we knew not what kinds, that the poor boy was ready to die with fear, and begged of me not to go on shore till day. Well, Xury, said I, that I won't. But it may be we may see men by day who will be as bad to us as those lions. Then we give them the shoot gun, said Xury, laughing. Make them run away. Such English Xury spoke by conversing among us slaves. However, I was glad to see the boy so cheerful, and I gave him a dram out of our patron's case of bottles to cheer him up. After all, Xury's advice was good, and I took it. We dropped our little anchor and lay still all night. I say still, for we slept none, for in 2 or 3 hours we saw vast great creatures, we knew not what to call them, of many sorts come down to the seashore and run into the water, wallowing and washing themselves for the pleasure of cooling themselves, and they made such hideous howlings and yellings that I never indeed heard the like. Xury was dreadfully frightened, and indeed so was I too, but we were both more frightened when we heard one of these mighty creatures come swimming towards our boat. We could not see him, but we might hear him by his blowing to be a monstrous, huge, and furious beast. Xury said it was a lion, and it might be so, for aught I know, but poor Xury cried to me to weigh the anchor and row away. No, says I. Xury, we could slip our cable with the buoy to it and go off to sea. They cannot follow us far. I had no sooner said so, but I perceived the creature, whatever it was, within 2 oars' length, which something surprised me. However, I immediately stepped to the cabin door, and taking up my gun, fired at him, upon which he immediately turned about and swam towards the shore again. But it is impossible to describe the horrible noises and hideous cries and howlings that were raised as well upon the edge of the shore as higher within the country upon the noise or report of the gun, a thing I have some reason to believe those creatures had never heard before. This convinced me that there was no going on shore for us in the night upon that coast. And how to venture on shore in the day was another question too, for to have fallen into the hands of any of the savages had been as bad as to have fallen into the hands of lions and tigers. At least we were equally apprehensive of the danger of it. Be that as it would, we were obliged to go on shore somewhere or other for water, for we had not a pint left in the boat when, or where, to get it was the point. Xury said if I would let him go on shore with one of the jars, he would find if there was any water and bring some to me. I asked him why he should go, why I should not go and he stay in the boat. The boy answered with so much affection that made me love him ever after. Said he, "If a wild man's come, they eat me, you go away." Well, Xury, said I, we will both go, and if the wild man comes, we will kill them, and they shall eat neither of us. So I gave Xury a piece of rusk bread to eat and a dram out of our patron's case of bottles, which I mentioned before, and we hauled in the boat as near the shore as we thought was proper, and so waded to shore, carrying nothing but our arms and 2 jars for water. I did not care to go out of sight of the boat, fearing the coming of canoes with savages down the river, but the boy, seeing a low place about a mile up the country, rambled to it, and by I saw him come running towards me. I thought he was being pursued by some savage, or frightened with some wild beast, and I ran towards him to help him, but when I came nearer to him, I saw something hanging over his shoulders, which was a creature that he had shot, like a hare, but different in color and longer legs. However, we were very glad of it, and it was very good meat. But the great joy that poor Xury came with was to tell me he had found good water, and had seen no wild mans. But we found afterwards that we had need not take such pains for water, for a little higher up the creek where we were, found the fresh water when the tide was out, which flowed but a little way up, so we filled our jars and feasted upon the hare we had killed, and prepared to go on our way, having seen no footsteps or any human creature in that part of country. As I had been one voyage to this coast before, I knew very well that the islands of the Canaries and the Cape de Verde Islands also lay not far off from the coast, but as I had no instruments to take an observation, to know what latitude we were in, and did not exactly know, or at least remember, what latitude they were in, I knew not where to look for them, or when to stand off to sea towards them. Otherwise I might now easily have found some of these islands, but my hope was that if I stood still along this coast till I came to that part where the English traded, I should find some of their vessels upon their usual design of trade that would relieve and take us in. By the best of my calculation, that place where I now was must be the country which, lying between the Emperor of Morocco's dominions and the ends, lie waste and uninhabited except by the wild beasts, the ends having abandoned it and gone farther south for the fear of the Moors, and the Moors not thinking it worth inhabiting by reason of its barrenness, and indeed both forsaking it because of the prodigious number of tigers, lions, leopards, and other furious creatures which arbor there, so that the Moors use it for their hunting only, where they go like an army, 2,000 or 3,000 men at a time. And indeed for near 100 miles together upon this coast we saw nothing but a waste uninhabited country by day, and heard nothing but howlings and roarings of wild beasts by night. Once or twice in the daytime I thought I saw the Pico of Teneriffe, being the high top of the mountain Teneriffe in the Canaries, and had a great mind to venture out in hopes of reaching thither, but having tried twice, I was forced in again by the contrary winds, the sea also going too high for my little vessel, so I resolved to pursue my first design and keep along the shore. Several times I was obliged to land for fresh water after we had left this place, and once in particular, being early in the morning, we came to an anchor under a little point of land which was pretty high, and the tide beginning to flow, we lay still to go further in. Xury, whose eyes were more about him than it seemed mine were, called softly to me and told me that we had best go farther off the shore. "For," said he, "look, yonder lies a dreadful monster on the side of that hillock, very fast asleep." I looked at where he pointed and saw a dreadful monster indeed, for it was a terrible great lion that lay on the side of the shore under the shade of a piece of the hill that hung as if it were a little over him. "Xury," said I, "you shall go on shore and kill him." Xury looked frightened and said, "Me kill? He eat me at one mouth." One mouthful, he meant. However, I said no more to the boy, but bade him lie still, and I took our biggest gun, which was almost musket-bore, and loaded with a good charge of powder, and with 2 slugs, and laid it down. And I loaded another gun with 2 bullets, and the third, for we had 3 pieces, I loaded with 5 smaller bullets. I took the best aim I could with the first piece to have shot him in the head, but he lay so with his leg raised a little above his nose that the slugs hit him about the knee and broke the bone. He started up growling at first, but finding his leg broke, fell down again, and then got up upon 3 legs and gave the most hideous roar that ever I heard. I was a little surprised I had not hit him on the head. However, I took up the second piece immediately, and, though he began to move off, fired again, and shot him into the head, and had the pleasure to see him drop, and make but little noise, but lay struggling for life. Then Xury took heart, and would have let him go on shore. "Well, go," said I. So the boy jumped into the water, and taking a little gun in one hand, swam to shore with the other, and, coming close to the creature, put the muzzle of the piece to his ear and shot him into the head again, with which dispatched him quite. This was game indeed to us, but this was no food, and I was very sorry to lose 3 charges of powder and shot upon a creature that was good for nothing to us. However, Xury said he would have some of him, so he comes on board and asked me to give him the hatchet. "For what, Xury?" said I. "Me cut off his head," said he. However, Xury could not cut off his head, but he cut off a foot and brought it with him, and it was a monstrous great one. I bethought myself, however, that perhaps the skin of him might be one way or another of some value to us, and I resolved to take off his skin if I could. So Xury and I went to work with him, but Xury was much the better workman at it, for I knew very ill how to do it. Indeed, it took us both the whole day, but at last we got off the hide of him, and spreading it on the top of our cabin, the sun effectually dried it in 2 days' time, and it afterwards served me to lie upon. After this stop, we made on to the southward continually for 10 or 12 days, living very sparing on our provisions, which began to abate very much, and going no oftener into the shore than we were obliged to for fresh water. My design in this was to make the river Gambia or Senegal, that is to say, anywhere about the Cape de Verde, where I was in hopes to meet with some European ship, and if I did not, I knew not what course I had to take, but to seek out for the islands or perish there among the inns. I knew that all the ships from Europe which sailed either to the coast of Guinea or to Brazil or to the East Indies made this cape or those islands, and, in a word, I put the whole of my fortune upon this single point, either that I must meet with some ship or must perish. When I had pursued this resolution about 10 days longer, as I have said, I began to see that the land was uninhabited. And in 2 or 3 places as we sailed by, we saw people stand upon the shore to look at us. We could also perceive they were quite black, and stark naked. I was once inclined to have gone on shore to them, but Xury was my better counselor, and said to me, "No go, no go." However, I hauled in nearer the shore that I might talk to them, and I found they ran along the shore by me a good way. I observed they had no weapon in their hands except one, who had a long, slender stick, which Xury said was a lance, and that they would throw them a great way with good aim. So I kept at a distance, but talked with them by signs as well I could, and particularly made signs for something to eat. They beckoned me to stop my boat, and that they would fetch me some meat. Upon this I lowered the top of my sail and lay by, and 2 of them ran up into the country, and in less than half an hour came back, and brought with them 2 pieces of dried fish and some corn, such as is the produce of their country. But we knew neither what the one or the other was. However, we were willing to accept it, but how to come at it was our next dispute, for I was not for venturing on shore to them, and they were much afraid of us. But they took a safe way for us all, for they brought it to the shore and laid it down, and went and stood a great way off till we fetched it on board, and then came close to us again. We made sign of thanks to them, for we had nothing to make them amends, but an opportunity offered that very instant to oblige them wonderfully, for while we were lying by the shore came 2 mighty creatures, one pursuing the other, as we took it, with great fury from the mountains toward the sea. Whether it was the male pursuing the female, or whether they were in sport or in rage, we could not tell, any more than we could tell whether it was usual or strange, but I believe it was the latter, because in the first place those ravenous creatures seldom appear but in the night, and in the second place we found the people terribly frightened, especially the women. The man that had the lance or dart did not fly from them, but the rest did. However, as the 2 creatures ran directly into the water, they did not seem to offer to fall upon any of the ends, but plunged themselves into the sea and swam about, as if they had come for their diversion. At last one of them began to come nearer our boat than at first I expected, but I lay ready for him, for I had loaded my gun with all possible expedition, and bade Xury load both the others. As soon as he came fairly within my reach, I fired, and shot him directly into the head. Immediately he sunk down into the water, but rose instantly, and plunged up and down as if he was struggling for life, so indeed he was. He immediately made the shore, but between the wound, which was his mortal hurt, and the strangling of the water, he died just before he reached the shore. It was impossible to express the astonishment of these poor creatures at the noise and fire of my gun. Some of them were even ready to die of fear, and fell down as dead with the very terror. But when they saw the creature dead and sunk in the water, and that I made signs for them to come to the shore, they took heart, and came to the shore, and began to search for the creature. I found him by his blood staining the water, and by the help of a rope which I slung around him and gave the ends to haul, they dragged him on the shore, and found that it was a most curious leopard, spotted and fine to an admirable degree, and the ends held up their hands with admiration to think what I had killed him with. The other creature, frightened with the flash of fire and the noise of the gun, swam on shore, and ran up directly to the mountains from whence they came, nor could I, at this distance, know what it was. I found quickly the ends were for eating the flesh of this creature, so I was willing to have them take it as a favor from me, which, when I made signs to tell them they may take it, they were very thankful for. Immediately they fell to work with him, and though they had no knife, yet with a sharpened piece of wood they took off his skin as readily, and much more readily than we could have done with a knife. They offered me some of the flesh, which I declined, making as if I would give it to them, but made signs for the skin, which they gave me very freely, and brought me a great deal more of their provision, which, though I did not understand, yet I accepted. Then I made signs to them for some water, and held out one of my jars to them, turning it bottom upward to show that it was empty, and that I wanted to have it filled. They called immediately to some of their friends, and there came 2 women, and brought a great vessel made of earth, and burnt, as I suppose, in the sun. This they set down for me, as before, and I sent Xury to shore with my jars, and filled them all 3. The women were as stark naked as the men. I was now furnished with roots and corn, such as it was, and water, and leaving my friendly inns, I made forward for about 11 days more, without offering to go near the shore, till I saw the land rim out at great length into the sea, at about the distance of 4 or 5 leagues before me, and the sea being very calm. I kept a large offing to make this point. At length, doubling the point at about 2 leagues from the land, I saw plainly land on the other side to seaward. Then I concluded, as it most certain indeed, that this was the Cape de Verde, and those the islands called from thence Cape de Verde Islands. However, they were at a great distance, and I could not tell what I had best to do, for I should be taken with a fresh wind. I might neither reach one or the other. In this dilemma, as I was very pensive, I stepped into the cabin and sat me down, Xury taking the helm, when on a sudden the boy cried out, Master, a ship with a sail!" And the foolish boy was frightened out of his wits, thinking it must needs be some of his master's ships sent to pursue us. When I knew we had gotten far enough out of their reach, I jumped out of the cabin and immediately saw not only the ship, but what she was, viz. That it was a Portuguese ship, and that, as I thought, was bound to the coast of Guinea for inns. But when I observed the course she steered, I was soon convinced they were bound some other way, and did not design to come any nearer to the shore, upon which I stretched out to sea as much I could, resolving to speak with them, if possible. With all the sail I could make, I found I should not be able to come into their way, and that they would have be gone before I could make any signal to them. But after I had crowned to the utmost and began to despair, they, it seemed, saw me by the help of their perspective glasses, and that it was some European boat which, as they supposed, must belong to some ship that was lost, so they shortened sail to let me come up. I was encouraged with this, and as I had my patron's flag on board, I made a waft of it to them for a signal of distress, and fired a gun, both of which they saw, for they told me they saw the smoke, though they did not hear the gun. Upon these signals they very kindly brought to and lay by for me, and in about 3 hours' time I came up with them. They asked me what I was, in Portuguese, and in Spanish, and in French, but I understood none of them. But at last a Scots sailor, who was on board, called to me, and I answered him, and told him I was an Englishman, that I had made my escape out of slavery from the Moors at Sallee. Then they bade me come on board, and very kindly took me in, and all my goods. It was an inexpressible joy to me, that anyone will believe, that I was thus delivered, as I esteemed it, from such a miserable and almost hopeless condition as I was in, and I immediately offered all I had to the captain of the ship as a return for my deliverance. But he generously told me he would take nothing from me, but that all I had should be delivered safe to me when I came to the Brazils. "For," says he, "I have saved your life on no other terms than I would be glad to be saved myself, and it may one time or other be my lot to be taken up in the same condition. Besides," says he, "when I carry you to the Brazils, so great away from your own country, if I should take from you what you have, you'll be starved there, and then I only take away the life I have given. No. Senor Inglés," says he, "Mr. Englishman, I will carry you thither in charity, and those things will help you by your subsistence there, and your passage home again." Chapter 4. He settles in the Brazils as a planter, makes another voyage, and is shipwrecked. As he was charitable in his proposal, so he was just in the performance to a tittle, for he offered the seamen that none should offer to touch anything I had. Then he took everything into his own possession and gave me back an exact inventory of them, that I might have them, even so much as my 3 earthen jars. As to my boat, it was a very good one, and that he saw, and told me he would buy it of me for the ship's use, and asked me what I would have for it. I told him he had been so generous to me in everything that I could not offer to make any price for the boat, but left it entirely to him, upon which he told me he would give me a note of his hand to pay me 80 pieces of 8 for it at Brazil, and when it came there, if anyone offered to give me more, he would make it up. He offered me also 60 pieces of 8 more for my boy, Xury, which I was loth to take, not that I was not willing to let the captain have him, but I was very loth to sell the poor boy's liberty, who had assisted me so faithfully in procuring my own. However, when I let him know my reason, he owned it to be just, and offered me this medium, that he would give the boy an obligation to set him free in 10 years if he turned Christian. Upon this, and Xury saying he was willing to go to him, I let the captain have him. We had a very good voyage to the Brazils, and arrived in the bay de Todos los Santos, or All Saints' Bay, in about 22 days after. And now I was once more delivered from the most miserable of all conditions of life, and what to do next with myself I was now to consider. The generous treatment the captain gave me I can never enough remember. He would take nothing of me for my passage, gave me 20 ducats for the leopard skin and 40 for the lion skin which I had in my boat, and caused everything I had in the ship to be punctually delivered me, and what I was willing to sell he brought, such as the case of bottles, 2 of my guns, and a piece of the lump of beeswax, for I had made candles of the rest. In a word, I made about 220 pieces of 8 of all my cargo, and with this stock I went on shore in the Brazils. I had not been long here, but being recommended to the house of a good honest man like himself, who had a ingénot, as they called it, that is, a plantation and a sugar house, I lived with him some time, and acquainted myself by that means with the manner of their planting and making of sugar, and seeing how well the planters lived, and how they grew rich suddenly, I resolved, if I could get a license to settle there, I would turn planter among them, resolving in the meantime to find some way to get my money which I left in London remitted to me. To this purpose, getting a letter of naturalization, I purchased as much land that was uncured as my money would reach, and formed a plan for my plantation and settlement, and such a one as might be suitable to the stock which I proposed to myself to receive from England. I had a neighbor, a Portuguese of Lisbon, but born of English parents, whose name was Wells, and in much such circumstance as I was, I call him my neighbor, because his plantation lay next to mine, and we went on very sociably together. My stock was but low as well as his, and we rather planted for food than anything else for about 2 years. However, we began to increase, and our land began to come into order, so that the 3rd year we planted some tobacco, and made each of us a large piece of ground ready for planting canes in the year to come. But we both wanted help, and now I found more than before I had done wrong in parting with my boy Xury. But alas, for me to do wrong that never did right was no great wonder. I had no remedy but to go on. I was gotten into an employment quite remote to my genius, and directly contrary to the light life I delighted in, and for which I forsook my father's house, and broke through all his good advice. Nay, I was coming into the very middle station, or upper degree of low life, which my father advised me to before, and which, if I resolved to go on with, I might as well stayed at home, and never have fatigued myself in the world as I had done. And as I used often to say to myself, I could have done this as well in England among my friends, as have gone 5,000 miles off to do it among strangers and savages, in a wilderness, and at such a distance as never to hear from any part of the world that had the least knowledge of me. In this manner I used to look upon my condition with the utmost regret. I had nobody to converse with, but now and then this neighbor, no work to be done but by the labor of my hands, and I used to say I lived just like a man cast away upon some desolate island that had nobody there but himself. But how just has it been? And how should all men reflect that when they compare their present conditions with others that are worse? Heaven may oblige them to make the exchange and be convinced of their former felicity by their experience. I say, how just has it been that the truly solitary life I reflected on in an island of mere desolation should be my lot, who had so often unjustly compared it with the life which I then led, in which, had I continued, I had in all probability been exceeding prosperous and rich. I was in some degree settled in my measures for carrying on the plantation before my kind friend, the captain of the ship that took me up at sea, went back. For the ship remained there in providing his loading and preparing for his voyage near 3 months, when, telling him what little stock I had left behind me in London, he gave me this friendly and sincere advice. "Signor Inglés," says he, for he always called me, "if you will give me letters and a procuration here informed to me, with orders to a person who has your money in London to send your effects to Lisbon, to such persons as I shall direct, and in such goods as are proper for this country, I will bring you the produce of them, God willing, at my return. But since human affairs are all subject to changes and disaster, I would have you give orders but for £100 sterling, which you say is half your stock, and let the hazard be run for the last, so that if it may come safe, you may order the rest the same way, and if it miscarry, you may have the other half to have recourse to you for your supply." This was so wholesome advice and looked so friendly that I could not be but convinced it was the best course I could take, and so accordingly prepared letters to the gentlewoman with whom I had left my money, and a procuration to the Portuguese captain, as he desired. I wrote to the English captain's widow a full account of my adventures, my slavery, escape, and how I had met with the Portuguese captain at sea, the humanity of his behavior, and in what condition I was now in, with all other necessary directions for my supply. And when this honest captain came to Lisbon, he found means, by some of the English merchants there, to send over not the order only, but a full account of my story to a merchant at London, who represented it effectually to her, whereupon she not only delivered the money, but out of her own pocket sent the Portuguese captain a very handsome present for his humanity and charity to me. The merchant in London, vesting this £100 in English goods, such as the captain had written for, sent them directly to him at Lisbon, and he brought them all safe to me to the Brazils, among which, without my direction, for I was too young in my business to think of them, he had taken care to have all sorts of tools, ironwork, and utensils necessary for my plantation, and which were of great use to me. When this cargo arrived, I thought my fortune made, for I was surprised with the joy of it, and my good steward, the captain, had laid out the £5, which my friend had sent him for a present for himself, to purchase and bring me over a servant under bond for 6 years' service, and would not accept of any consideration except a little tobacco, which I would have him accept, being of my own produce. Neither was this all, but my goods being all English manufactures, such as cloth, stuffs, baize, and things particularly valuable and desirable in the country, I found means to sell them to a very great advantage, so that I may say I had more than 4 times the value of my first cargo, and was now infinitely beyond my poor neighbor. I mean in the advancement of my plantation, for the first thing I did, I brought me a slave, and a European servant also, I mean another besides that which the captain brought me from Lisbon. But as abused prosperity is oftentimes made the very means of our greatest adversity, so was it with me. I went on the next year with great success in my plantation. I raised 50 great rolls of tobacco on my own ground, more than I had disposed of for necessities among my neighbors, and these 50 rolls, being each of above 100 weight, were well cured and laid by against the return of the fleet from Lisbon. And now, increasing in business and in wealth, my head began to be full of projects and undertakings beyond my reach, such as are, indeed, often the ruin of the best heads in business. Had I continued in the station I was now in, I had room for all the happy things to have yet befallen me, for which my father so earnestly recommended a quiet, retired life, and of which he had so sensibly described the middle station of life to be full of. But other things attended me, and I was still to be the wilful agent of all my own miseries, and particularly to increase my fault and double the reflections upon myself, which in my future sorrows I should have leisure to make. All these miscarriages were procured by my apparent obstinate adhering to my foolish inclination of wandering abroad, and pursuing that inclination in contradiction to the clearest views of doing myself good in a fair and plain pursuit of these prospects and those measures of life which nature and providence concurred to present me with, and to make my duty. As I had once done thus in my breaking away from my parents, so I could not be content now, but I must go and leave the happy view I had of being a rich and thriving man in my new plantation, only to pursue a rash and immoderate desire of rising faster than the nature of the thing admitted, and thus I cast myself down again into the deepest gulf of human misery that ever man fell into, or perhaps could be consistent with life and a state of health in the world. To come, then, by the just degrees to the particulars of this part of my story, you may suppose that, having now lived almost 4 years in the Brazils, and beginning to thrive and prosper very well upon my plantation, I had not only learned the language, but had contracted acquaintance and friendship among my fellow planters, as well as among the merchants of St. Salvador, which was our port, and that in my discourses among them I had frequently given them an account of my 2 voyages to the coast of Guinea, the manner of trading with the inns there, and how easy it was to purchase upon the coast for trifles such as beads, toys, knives, scissors, hatchets, bits of glass, and the like, not only gold dust, guinea grains, elephant's teeth, etc., but inns for the service of the Brazils in great numbers. They listened always very attentively to my discourses on these heads, but especially to the part which related to the buying inns, which was a trade at that time not only not far entered into, but, as far as it was, had been carried on by the asiento, or permission, of the kings of Spain and Portugal, and engrossed in the public, so that few inns were bought, and those excessive dear. It happened, being in company with some merchants and planters of my acquaintance, and talking of those things very earnestly, 3 of them came to me the next morning, and told me that they had been musing very much upon what I had discoursed with them of the last night, and they came to make a secret proposal to me. And after enjoining me in secrecy, they told me that they had a mind to fit out a ship to go to Guinea, that they had all plantations as well as I, and were straitened for nothing so much as servants, that as it was a trade that could not be carried on because they could not publicly sell the inns when they came home, so they desired to make but 1 voyage, to bring the inns on shore privately, and divide them among their own plantations, and, in a word, the question was, would I go as their supercargo in the ship, to manage the trading part upon the coast of Guinea? And they offered me that I should have my equal share of the inns without providing any part of the stock. This was a fair proposal, it must be confessed, had it been made to anyone that had not had a settlement and plantation of his own to look after, which was in a fair way of coming to be very considerable, and with a good stock upon it. But for me, that was thus entered and established, and had nothing to do but go on as I had begun, for 3 or 4 years more, and to have sent for the other £100 from England, and who, in that time, and with that little addition, could scarce have failed of being worth 3 or 4,000 pounds sterling, and that increasing too, for me to think of such a voyage, was the most preposterous thing that ever man in such circumstance could be guilty of. But I, that was born to be my own destroyer, could no more resist the offer than I could restrain my first rambling designs, when my father's good counsel was lost upon me. In a word, I told them I would go with all my heart, if they would undertake to look after my plantation in my absence, and would dispose of it, such as I should direct if I miscarried. This they all engaged to do, and entered into writings or covenants to do so. I made a formal will disposing of my plantation and effects in case of my death, making the captain of the ship that had saved my life, as before, my universal heir, but obliging him to dispose of my effects as I had directed in my will, one half of the produce being to himself and the other to be shipped to England. In short, I took all possible caution to preserve my effects and keep up my plantation. Had I used half as much prudence to have looked into my own interest, and have made a judgment of what I ought to have done and not to have done, I had certainly never gone away from so prosperous an undertaking, leaving all the probable views of a thriving circumstance, and gone upon a voyage to sea, attended with all its common hazards, to say nothing of the reasons I had to expect particular misfortunes to myself. But I was hurried on, and obeyed blindly the dictates of my fancy rather than my reason, and accordingly, the ship being fitted out, and the cargo furnished, and all things done as by agreement by my partners in the voyage, I went on board in an evil hour, the 1st of September, 1659, being the same day 8 years that I went from my father and mother at Hull, in order to act the rebel to their authority, and the fool to my own interest. Our ship was about 120 tons burden, carried 6 guns and 14 men, besides the master, his boy, and myself. We had on board no large cargo of goods, except of such toys as were fit our trade with the ends, such as beads, bits of glass, shells, and odd trifles, especially little looking-glasses, knives, scissors, hatchets, and the like. The same day I went on board we set sail, standing away to the northward upon our own coast, with a design to stretch over the African coast, when they came about 10 or 12 degrees of northern latitude, which, it seems, was the manner of their course in those days. We had very good weather, only excessive hot, all the way upon our own coast, till we came to the height of Cape St. Augustino, from whence, keeping further off at sea, we lost sight of land, and steered as if we were bound for the Isle Fernando de Noronha, holding our course northeast by north, and leaving those isles on the east. In this course, we passed the line in about 12 days' time, and were, by our last observation, in 7 degrees 22 minutes northern latitude, when a violent tornado, or hurricane, took us quite out of our knowledge. It began from the southeast, came about to the northwest, and then settled into the northeast, from whence it blew in such a terrible manner that for 12 days altogether we could do nothing but drive, and scuttling away before it, let it carry us wherever fate and fury of the winds directed. And during these 12 days, I need not say that I expected every day to be swallowed up, nor, indeed, did any of the ship expect to save their lives. In this distress we had, beside the terror of the storm, one of our men die of the fever, and one man and the boy washed overboard. About the 12th day, the weather abating a little, the master made an observation as well as he could, and found that he was in about 11 degrees north latitude, but that he was 22 degrees of longitude difference west from Cape St. Augustino, so that he found he was gotten upon the coast of Guiana, or the northern part of Brazil, beyond the river Amazon, toward that of the river Orinoco, commonly called the Great River, and began to consult with me what course he should take, for the ship was leaky and very much disabled, and he was going directly back to the coast of Brazil. I was positively against that, and looking over the charts of the sea coast of America with him, we concluded that there was no inhabited country for us to have recourse to till we came within the circle of the Caribbee Islands, and therefore resolved to stand away for Barbados, which, by keeping off at the sea to avoid the indraft of the Bay or Gulf of Mexico, we might easily perform, as we hoped, in about 15 days' sail, whereas we could not possibly make our voyage to the coast of Africa without some assistance both to our ship and to ourselves. With this design we changed our course and steered away northwest by west, in order to reach some of the English islands, where I hoped for relief, but our voyage was otherwise determined. For being in the latitude of 12 degrees 18 minutes, a second storm came upon us, which carried us away with the same impetuosity westward, and drove us so out of the very way of all human commerce that, had all our lives been saved as to the sea, we were rather in danger of being devoured by savages than ever returning to our own country. In this distress, the wind still blowing very hard, one of our men, early in the morning, cried out, "Land!" And we had no sooner ran out of our cabin to look out in hopes of seeing whereabouts in the world we were, but the ship struck upon a sand, and in a moment, her motion being so stopped, the sea broke over her in such a manner that we expected we should all have perished immediately, and we were immediately driven into our close quarters to shelter from the very foam and spray of the sea. It is not easy for anyone who has not been in the like condition to describe or conceive the consternation of men in such circumstances. We knew nothing where we were, or upon what land it was we were driven, whether an island or the main, whether inhabited or not inhabited, and as the rage of the wind was still great, though rather less than at first, we could not so much as hope to have the ship hold many minutes without breaking in pieces, unless the winds, by a kind of miracle, should turn immediately about. In a word, we sat looking one upon another and expecting death every moment, and every man acting accordingly, as preparing for another world, for there was little or nothing more for us to do in this. That which was our present comfort, and all the comfort we had, was that, contrary to our expectation, the ship did not break yet, and that the master said the wind began to abate. Now, though we thought that the wind did a little abate, yet the ship, having thus struck upon the sand, and sticking too fast for us to expect her getting off, we were in a dreadful condition indeed, and had nothing to do but to think of saving our lives as well as we could. We had a boat at our stern just before the storm, but she was first staved by dashing against the ship's rudder, and the next place she broke away and either sunk or was driven off to sea, so there was no hope from her. We had another boat on board, but how to get her off into the sea was a doubtful thing. However, there was no room to debate, for we fancied the ship would break in pieces every minute, and some told us she was actually already broken. In this distress, the mate of our vessel lays hold of the boat, and with the help of the rest of the men, they got her slung over the ship's side, and getting all into her, let go and committed ourselves, being 11 in number, to God's mercy and the wild sea. For, though the storm was abated considerably, yet the sea went dreadful high upon the shore, and might as well be called Den Wild Zee, as the Dutch call the sea in a storm. And now our case was very dismal indeed, for we all saw plainly that the sea went so high that the boat could not live, and that we should be inevitably drowned. As to making sail, we had none, nor, if we had, could we have done anything with it, so we worked at the oar toward the land, though with heavy hearts, like men going to execution, for we all knew that when the boat came nearer the shore, she would be dashed in 1,000 pieces by the breach of the sea. However, we committed our souls to God in the most earnest manner, and the wind driving us toward the shore, we hastened our destruction with our own hands, pulling as well as we could towards land. What the shore was, whether rock or sand, whether steep or shoal, we knew not. The only hope that could rationally give us the least shadow of expectation was, if we may happen into some bay or gulf, or the mouth of some river, where by great chance we might have run our boat in, or got under the lee of the land, or perhaps made smooth water. But there was nothing of this appeared. But as we made nearer and nearer the shore, the land looked more frightful than the sea. After we had rowed, or rather driven, about 1.5 leagues, as we reckoned it, a raging wave, mountain-like, came rolling astern of us, and plainly bade us expect the coup de grace. In a word, it took us with such a fury that it overset the boat at once, and, separating us, as well from the boat as from one another, gave us not time hardly to say, "O God," for we were all swallowed up in a moment. Nothing can describe the confusion of which I felt when I sunk into the water. Though I swam very well, yet I could not deliver myself from the wave so as to draw breath, till that wave having driven me, or rather carried me a vast way on towards the shore, and having spent itself, went back, and left me upon the dry land, the land almost dry, but half dead with the water I took in. I had so much presence of mind as well as breath left that, seeing myself nearer the mainland than I expected, I got upon my feet and endeavored to make towards the land as fast as I could before another wave should return and take me up again. But I soon found it was impossible to avoid it, for I saw the sea come up after me as high as a great hill and as furious as an enemy, which I had no means of strength to contend with. My business was to hold my breath and raise myself upon the water, if I could, and so by swimming to preserve my breathing, and pilot myself towards the shore, if possible. My greatest concern now being that the sea, as it would carry me a great way towards the shore when it came on, might not carry me back again with it when it gave back towards the sea. The wave that came upon me again buried me at once 20 or 30 feet deep in its own body, and I could feel myself carried with a mighty force and swiftness toward the shore a very great way. But I held my breath, and assisted myself to swim still forward with all my might. I was busy, ready to burst with holding my breath, when, as I felt myself rising up, so to my immediate relief, I found my head and hands shoot out above the surface of the water, and though it was not 2 seconds of time that I keep myself so, yet it relieved me greatly, gave me breath and new courage. I was covered again with water a good while, but not so long. But I held it out, and finding the water had spent itself and began to return, I struck forward against the return of the waves and felt the ground again with my feet. I stood still a few moments to recover breath until the water went from me, and then took to my heels and ran with what strength I had further towards the shore. But neither would this deliver me from the fury of the sea, which came pouring in after me again, and twice more I was lifted up by the waves and carried forwards as before, the shore being very flat. The last time of these two had well near been fatal to me, for the sea, having hurried me along as before, landed me, or rather dashed me, against a piece of rock, and that with such force as it left me senseless, and indeed helpless as to my own deliverance. For the blow taking my side and breast beat the breath as it were quite out of my body, and had it returned again immediately, I must have been strangled in the water. But I recovered a little before the return of the waves, and seeing I should be covered again with water, I resolved to hold fast by a piece of the rock, and so to hold my breath, if possible, till the wave went back. Now, as the waves were not so high as the first, being near land, I held my hold till the wave abated, and then fetched another run, which brought me up near the shore, that the next wave, though it went over me, yet did not swallow me up as to carry me away. And the next run I took in got to the mainland, where, to my great comfort, I clambered up the cliffs of the shore, and sat down upon the grass, free from danger and quite out of reach of the water. I was now landed, and safe on shore, and began to look up and thank God that my life was saved, in a case wherein there was some minutes before scarce any room to hope. I believe it was impossible to express to the life what the ecstasies and transports of the soul are when it is so saved, as I may say, out of the very grave. And I do not wonder now at that custom, viz., that when a malefactor who has the halter about his neck is tied up and just going to be turned off and has a reprieve brought to him, I do not wonder that they bring a surgeon with it, to let his blood, that every moment they tell him of it, that the surprise may not drive the animal spirits from his heart and overwhelm him. For sudden joys, like griefs, confound at first. I walked about on the shore, lifting up my hands, and my whole being, as I may say, wrapped up in the contemplation of my deliverance, making 1,000 gestures and motions which I cannot describe, reflecting upon all my comrades that were drowned, and that there should not be one soul saved but myself, for, as for them, I never saw them afterwards, or any sign of them except 3 of their hats, 1 cap, and 2 shoes that were not fellows. I cast my eyes to the stranded vessel when the breach and froth of the sea being so big I could hardly see it. It lay so far off, and considered, Lord, how was it possible I could get on shore? After I had solaced my mind with the comfortable part of my condition, I began to look round me to see what kind of place I was in, and what was next to be done, and I soon found my comforts abate, and that in a word I had a dreadful deliverance, for I was wet, had no clothes to shift me, nor anything to eat or drink to comfort me, neither did I see any prospect before me but that of perishing with hunger, or being devoured by wild beasts, and which was particularly afflicting me was that I had no weapon either to hunt and kill any creature for my sustenance, or to defend myself against any other creature that might desire to kill me for theirs. In a word, I had nothing about me but a knife, a tobacco pipe, and a little tobacco in a box. This was all my provision, and this threw me into a terrible agonies of mind. For a while I ran about like a madman. Night coming upon me, I began with a heavy heart to consider what would be my lot if there were any ravenous beasts in that country, seeing at night that they always come abroad for their prey. All the remedy that offered to my thought at that time was to get up into a thick, bushy tree like a fir, but thorny, which grew near me, and where I resolved to sit all night and consider the next day what death I should die, for as yet I saw no prospect of life. I walked about a furlong from the shore to see if I could find any fresh water to drink, which I did, to my great joy. And having drank and put a little tobacco in my mouth to prevent hunger, I went to the tree, and getting up into it, endeavored to place myself so as that if I should sleep I might not fall. And having cut me a short stick like a truncheon for my defense, I took up my lodging, and having been excessively fatigued, I fell fast asleep, and slept as comfortably as I believe few could have done in my condition, and found myself the most refreshed with it that I think I ever was on such an occasion.